The cold stone of the castle walls never truly warmed, even in the height of summer. At dawn, the castle stirred long before the lords and ladies ever opened their eyes. In the lower levels, beneath tapestries and stone arches, where the rushes on the floor absorbed the dripping of condensation and the echoes of footsteps, a different world lived and breathed. It was a world of soft whispers, clattering pots, and quiet obedience. It was the realm of the servants. Before the first rooster crowed, the baker's boy was already awake. He had no name anyone bothered to use. To the cook, he was you there. To the steward, he was boy. His feet were calloused, and his hands bore the scars of burns, cuts, and flour ground into every crease of his fingers. He had been born in service, as had his father and his mother before that. No one asked if he desired another life. The castle was the world, and the work was as constant as breath. He carried a stack of firewood across the icy floor of the kitchen, stepping lightly to avoid waking the cook too soon. A heavy ladle flew if you stirred her temper before the sun crested the eastern towers. Bread had to be mixed, kneaded, baked. The ovens, massive bellies of red-hot stone, devoured wood by the armful. The baker's boy fed them like beasts and bore their heat without complaint. He knew that even the slightest scorch on a loaf might earn him the back of the cook's wooden spoon, or worse, a report to the steward. Above him, unseen, the castle slumbered, but beneath it, a small army toiled. The chambermaids began their morning rituals just after the baker. They moved like shadows, passing one another in narrow halls without a word, each bearing armfuls of linen and bundles of dried herbs. The rushes strewn across the floor of the king's halls had to be replaced, especially in winter when muck clung to every boot. The herbs, lavender, thyme, rosemary, masked the scent of unwashed bodies and open hearths. Chamber pots were emptied by trembling hands, some too young for the work, their eyes watering with every trip to the waste pit. In the queen's chambers, 2 girls shared the task of folding the bedclothes, smoothing the velvet blankets, and brushing the dust from the carved bedposts. Every motion had to be exact. Even a thread out of place might earn a frown from the lady-in-waiting, and a frown could lead to punishment, which might mean fewer scraps at the evening meal. The servants were many, but no one counted them. They were not listed among the nobility, nor mentioned in ballads. Yet without them, no fire would be lit, no goblet filled, no royal backside wiped. The castle steward, tall and silent as a shadow at dusk, knew each one by face, if not by name. He was the axle around which the wheel of service turned. He held the keys, dozens of them, to pantries, armories, cellars, and rooms sealed from view. He passed through halls like a ghost, measuring candle wax and bread loaves with the same precision. He knew if a spit boy had slept too long, or a scullery maid had broken another plate. He knew who snuck meat scraps, who whispered to one another after hours, and who dreamed of escape. Escape. It was a dream as soft and pointless as cobwebs in the rafters. The castle was the sky, the stars, and the sea. The world outside its gates was a rumour passed between old women who remembered their village lives before they were pulled into the Lord's service during famine or war. Not far from the steward's domain was a small chamber, windowless, hidden behind a thick wooden door with iron hinges. Here dwelled the most unusual servant of all, the one entrusted with a task few spoke of, and none envied, the Groom of the Stool. The title sounded ridiculous to those who heard it for the first time, but in truth, it was a position of trust and curious honor. The groom was not some nameless figure. He had access to the king's private chambers at all hours. He bore the secrets of royal digestion, of groans and sighs, and the private business of every meal. He was often more educated than the cooks or guards, because discretion required intelligence. His hands were gloved when he worked, his cloths were the finest linen, and his tools were kept as meticulously as the king's armor. Yet no matter how clean the linens, or how perfumed the oils, he lived with the knowledge that his role was to kneel when others bowed. He did not serve the man who wore the crown. He served the body, the sweating, aching, aging body of a king who, like all men, must sit, strain, and sigh. He had once been a page, then a squire. Through some twist of courtly politics, he was elevated. Some said punished, others whispered rewarded. For the king liked to speak when no one else could hear. And in the most vulnerable of positions, he often confessed his doubts, his fury, his fears. The Groom of the Stool became not just a servant, but a confidant, and sometimes, on rare evenings when wine had loosened all tongues, an adviser. Few knew this, of course. To the other servants, he was a man with a strange fate and a quiet demeanor. He walked the corridors with a small wooden box tucked under one arm, always clean, always careful, always silent. The castle lived by breath and ritual. The great bell tolled at dawn, calling everyone to life. The hallways filled with clattering feet and murmurs. Servants carrying water sloshed past others, bearing meat pies. Boys ran with messages. Maids dusted high beams with long poles. Old men with bent backs pushed wheelbarrows filled with ashes from the night's fires. No one lingered. There were no idle minutes. To rest was to risk being seen. To be seen doing nothing was to risk a beating or banishment. The king and queen, nobles and barons, they moved above it all, gliding on polished floors in silks and jewels. But beneath their steps, a world of toil spun endlessly. Its people were born into service and died in it, sometimes without names on their graves. Yet in every sweep of a broom, every carefully folded napkin, every flickering candle replaced before the banquet, there was a quiet dignity. They held the castle together, not with swords, but with sweat. And still, the day had only just begun. The sun had barely risen past the castle's tallest turret when the steward made his first rounds. He held a wax tablet in one hand and a stylus in the other, inscribing small notations with each door he passed. Each whisper he overheard, each loaf he weighed by touch and instinct alone. The steward spoke little, for a word wasted was a moment lost, and the machinery of the castle could not abide delays. He passed through the buttery, where the butler and his assistants were already preparing jugs of ale and casks of wine for the midday meal. The butler bowed slightly, but said nothing. His domain was sacred. He oversaw the drink, the goblets, the carved drinking horns, used only in royal ceremonies. And though his position was a respected one, even he knew that he was part of the delicate food chain that ruled the world beneath the throne. In the scullery, steam clung to the beams like mist from a swamp. The scullery maids, young girls and older women, who had aged twice as fast from the endless scrubbing, were already elbow-deep in greasy pots and earthenware. Their hands, raw and pink, never fully healed from the constant exposure to lye and hot water. One of the older women, known only as Mags, hummed an old song as she worked, her voice barely audible over the rush of water and the clang of plates. It was said Mags had been in service for over 40 winters and could clean a roasting spit faster than most men could unsheath a sword. Outside the scullery, the stone floor curved slightly down to a series of narrow corridors, ventilation shafts and storage tunnels that only the bravest or most foolish servants dared to use. These passages were shortcuts known only to the oldest kitchen boys and the occasional rat catcher. They smelled of earth, mould, and old rushes, but they were fast, and speed was often the difference between praise and punishment. In the laundry yard, behind the castle's southern wing, lines of linen fluttered like pale flags of surrender. The laundresses, stout women with scarred wrists and perpetually damp skirts, beat the royal sheets with paddles of wood, then rinsed them in tubs of icy water drawn from the well by the youngest boys. Their knuckles bled in winter, their backs ached year-round, but their work was vital. A stain on the king's undershirt could be interpreted as an insult to divine order. Meanwhile, inside the upper halls, the chambermaids had already begun their silent ballet. They glided across polished floors on slippered feet, their heads bowed, their arms full of fresh linens and warmed cloths. They dared not speak when within sight of the courtiers. To speak without permission was to invite disgrace. To meet a nobleman's eyes was to risk a slap, or worse. Each chambermaid had memorized the positions of the tapestries, the count of the pillows, the angle at which the chairs were left. Some noble women took pleasure in rearranging items just to see if a maid noticed. Most did. The price of forgetfulness was humiliation, and humiliation could lead to dismissal. Dismissal, for a servant, was not a return to a simpler life. It was a sentence to starvation. The outside world held no safety. A servant without a household was little more than a beggar, wandering from estate to estate in search of scraps or shelter. That knowledge kept them obedient, alert, and silent. The pages, young boys of noble blood, placed in service to learn humility and protocol, stood apart. Though they were technically servants, they were watched with indulgent eyes. Their clumsiness was corrected gently, their mistakes forgiven. They carried messages, helped knights into their armor, and served at the royal table, but they did so as part of their training for future greatness. The true servants observed this with a mixture of contempt and pity. The pages knew nothing of hunger. They knew nothing of cold feet in stone corridors, of split fingernails, or of hiding bruises beneath their tunics. They lived in a different world, even within the same castle. Still, not all servants were born low. Some, like the current steward, had once been scribes or men-at-arms who had fallen out of favour but proved useful in subtler ways. Others had clawed their way up through competence and cunning. The castle remembered everything, and those who survived its grip for long enough learned how to move unseen, speak without sound, and serve without breaking. In the stable yard, the grooms were busy feeding and brushing the king's prize stallions. Each horse had its own cloths, oils, and diet. The grooms, often overlooked in discussions of castle life, held the power to calm a war horse with a word or provoke it with a look. They slept in straw beside the animals, waking at the softest whinny. They knew the names of every hoof, every scar, every mood of their charges. Their hands bore thick calluses, and the smell of hay clung to them even during feast days. The head groom, a man known only as Osric, had a long scar across his cheek and never spoke above a whisper. It was said he had once served the king in battle and chose the stable over the sword after watching too many men die. Osric's stable was as orderly as any chamber. The brushes hung in rows, the feed was sorted by grain type, and not a single saddle strap was ever found out of place. He ruled his small domain with quiet authority, and even the steward rarely intervened. And then there were the bell ringers. It was easy to forget them, perched high in the bell towers, cloaked in soot and pigeon droppings. But they marked the rhythm of the castle. At dawn, their bells woke the bakers. At noon, they signalled the midday meal. At dusk, they warned the servants to prepare for the royal supper. And at night, they tolled for the closing of the gates, the locking of the doors, and the start of the castle's uneasy sleep. Their hands were strong from pulling rope, their ears half deaf from years of resonance. But they alone saw the sunrise before anyone else. They alone watched the stars wheel above the towers. By the time the castle's nobles stirred from their feathered beds and called for warm water or morning wine, the servants had already lived a half day. Their backs ached, their mouths were dry, and their tasks had only just begun. None of them would eat until the nobles had finished. Often they stood behind the king's high table, watching as golden trenchers were piled with roasted quail, venison pies, and sugar-glazed fruits. They did not dare look longingly. The steward watched. So did the cook. A glance too long at the food might be seen as greed. Greed was dangerous. Only after the last goblet had been drained and the nobles had moved on to the gardens or hunting or prayer would the servants be permitted to eat. In the shadowed corner of the kitchens, beside the refuse bins and broken pottery, they would gather to eat what remained. Bones, crusts, the meat scraped from trenchers by careful fingers. And still they gave thanks, because they were inside the walls, because they had a roof above them and some coin on feast days, because to serve was to survive. Morning bled into midday as the sun crept higher over the battlements, gilding the slate roofs and glinting off the polished steel of the guardsmen's helms. Inside, the heart of the castle thudded with constant activity. To the unknowing eye, the grandeur of the court might seem effortless. Tapestries fluttered lightly from the walls. The great hall gleamed with swept floors and spotless tableware, and the king's banners billowed in the corridors, as if stirred by divine breath. But this illusion was the result of hundreds of hands moving constantly, precisely, and quietly. The daily life of a castle servant did not flow evenly or gently. It surged and ebbed like a tidal sea, dictated by bells, demands, and the moods of the nobility. A servant's value was not measured in gold, but in swiftness, discretion, and the ability to read a noble's face before a word was spoken. The first hours after the morning bell were often the most punishing. Every corner had to be inspected, every chamber reordered, every item in its exact place. The steward's rounds could bring reward or rebuke, and either might be delivered without a word. A nod could mean additional bread that night. A glance might signal a deduction in rations, or a change to a less desirable duty, such as waste hauling or night watch. Servants moved through the castle like water through hidden pipes, unseen but essential. There was a rhythm to their labor, a choreography no one taught, but all internalized. When to wait, when to move, when to vanish from view. To succeed in service was to anticipate needs before they were spoken. A true servant learned to observe without looking, to remember without writing, and to endure without protest. The younger boys, scullions, spit-turners and runners, suffered most in the kitchens. There, the air was always thick with smoke, grease, and the hiss of boiling pots. Spit boys were among the lowest in rank, their job to manually turn long iron rods upon which entire animals roasted. Their arms grew numb from repetition, and the heat scalded their faces, but a pause in the turning could mean uneven cooking, an offense punished severely. Sometimes one boy fainted from heat and exhaustion, and another stepped in without a word, for the meat would not wait for sympathy. Behind the kitchen, the pastry room remained cooler, though no less demanding. There, flour coated every surface like pale snow, and the head pastry cook ruled with sharp eyes and sharper blades. Pies had to be ornate, their crusts sculpted into flowers, birds, or coats of arms. Mistakes could not be hidden. Once baked, a ruined pie could not be redeemed. Many an apprentice learned quickly that precision mattered more than speed, though speed was never optional. At the other end of the hall, the wet nurse's chamber brimmed with the sound of infants, those born of noble blood or bastard lines, but too important to be left in a common cottage. The wet nurses, usually mothers themselves, offered not just milk, but warmth and care, though few were ever thanked. They rocked crying babes beside rush-covered floors, humming lullabies between feeding times. Some bonded with the children they nursed, only to see them taken away and dressed in silk, their mouths taught to speak, as if they'd never suckled at a servant's breast. In the laundries, water was life and labor. Buckets were drawn from the icy well and carried uphill to the washing yard, where great basins of copper steamed like cauldrons. Shirts, chemises, and undergarments of the nobility were boiled, scrubbed, wrung, and laid upon stones to dry. Women leaned over the basins with sleeves rolled high, wrists burning from endless scrubbing, their backs bent into shapes that never fully straightened again. The soap, made from lye and ash, ate into their skin over years. A servant's hands told their own story, wrinkled like old bark, cracked like the castle's stone steps. Even when not working, servants were rarely still. Time between duties was spent mending uniforms, cleaning tools, or fetching items for superiors. Leisure was brief and unofficial, snatches of rest stolen in corners or beside warm hearths when no one looked. Conversation was often hushed, interrupted by footsteps, the closing of a door, or the voice of a lord echoing down a hallway. Meals were hurried and eaten standing. Bread crusts, thin broth, salted pork, if one was lucky. Often, servants chewed quietly in groups, not speaking, simply grateful for warmth and something to fill the stomach. On feast days, scraps were more abundant, but so were the demands. One had to earn their morsels with sweat. At times, a servant was summoned not for cleaning, carrying, or cooking, but to be present, to hold a candle during a reading, to sit in a corner with bowed head while the noble dictated a letter, to escort a nobleman through a dark corridor, not because of danger, but because it was unseemly for her to walk alone. These silent roles were perhaps the most challenging, for they demanded absolute stillness, attention, and invisibility. The castle's mood shifted with the courts. If the king was in good spirits, the halls were warmer. Jokes passed from servant to servant like bread. If the queen was ill, or the barons were feuding, the air grew thick with tension. Servants tiptoed, words were measured. The smallest error could be met with anger, dismissal, or worse. Once, in the heart of winter, a young serving girl dropped a goblet meant for the prince. It shattered across the floor, the wine spreading like blood over the flagstones. She fell to her knees to clean it before it could soak her skirts. She was not struck, not then, but she was reassigned the next day to chamber pot duty in the lower reaches of the castle. Her name was no longer called in the kitchen or the linen room. She worked alone, carrying the waste of men and women too noble to soil the earth directly. She did this for weeks, until her hands bled and her voice vanished into the corridors. No one asked where she had gone. No one needed to. Her story was not unique. And still, for all its cruelties, service gave life structure. A servant could know where they would sleep, what they would wear, and how they would eat. Certainty that few outside the castle could claim. In famine the peasants starved. In war the peasants died. But inside the thick walls of the king's castle, the servant, if obedient and invisible, could survive. There were even moments of joy. A child born healthy to a laundress, a gift of a thick cloak passed down from the steward, a moment beside the fire when someone played a flute smuggled from a faraway fair. In these moments, laughter echoed where only orders usually did. They were brief, but they were enough to remind the servants that they were alive, not machines, but people. And there were friendships, even in hardship. The girl who shared her bread crust, the boy who covered your shift when you were ill, the old man who taught you which stones in the wall were warmest to lean against during winter. These bonds, formed without ceremony, were strong. They endured longer than the reign of kings. As the sun began its descent and the golden hour lit the castle in soft light, preparations for supper began. Torches were lit, bread was sliced, jugs were filled. Trenchers, thick slabs of bread used as plates, were stacked high, and the kitchen grew hotter than any forge. Everyone moved faster, every mistake more costly. For supper was not just a meal, it was a performance, and the servants, though uncredited, were the stagehands that made the show possible. By the time the trumpet sounded in the great hall, their echo ricocheting off the vaulted ceiling and down through the stairwells like the voice of a god announcing judgment, every servant in the castle was already in position. Supper in the royal court was not simply a time for nourishment. It was ritual, theatre, and power on display. For the servants, it was war fought in silence and coordination. Cooks barked orders under their breath as the final dishes were plated. Honey-glazed birds were brushed for shine, tarts checked for symmetry, sauces stirred one last time to preserve their velvet texture. Nothing was left to chance. A single hair, a speck of ash, a plate gone cold. Any of these could trigger the wrath of a noble or worse, the king himself. Down the hall, footmen lined up by the door. They were young and tall, chosen as much for their posture and composure as for their strength. They bore silver pitchers of wine, platters of meat, and baskets of freshly baked bread. Their tunics were pressed, their boots buffed until they caught the light, and their expressions blank. They were taught to look through people, not at them. They were not to react, not to falter. Even if wine spilled down their sleeves, or a noble spat food onto the floor near their feet, they were to serve without shifting emotion. Beneath the table, another class of servant moved, less visible, more vital. These were the runners and tray boys, those too young or too dirty to be present in the main procession, but needed for last-minute tasks. If a knife was forgotten, they fetched it. If the Queen's favourite sweetmeat was missing, they ran through smoke-filled corridors to retrieve it from the pantry. They crept like mice, watching the eyes of their elders for gestures that would signal what to do next. The groom of the cellar oversaw the drink, his underlings having spent the better part of the afternoon decanting wines, straining them through cloth, and testing for spoilage or sabotage. He tasted each barrel himself before nodding its approval. There was a grim pride in his duty. It was said that if the king were ever poisoned, it would likely be through wine. And so, he held both trust and fear in equal measure. No servant wanted to be the last to touch a goblet that reached a royal lip. Meanwhile, the groom of the Stool was always on quiet standby, never far from the king's private seat. Though the king would not need him during supper, he needed to be near enough to be summoned without delay. His movements were calculated and calm, always within the edge of candlelight, but never fully in view. Other servants respected him and avoided him in equal measure. His duty was considered both sacred and shameful, a contradiction wrapped in silk gloves and scented oils. Servants in the gallery above watched silently. These were mostly older ones, past their prime, relegated to candle tending and curtain pulling. They ensured the hall looked regal, that no flame flickered too low, no draperies sagged, even in age. Their eyes were sharp. One man, bent and grey with knotted fingers, had once been a page to the previous king. Now he adjusted candle wicks and whispered prayers into the stone as he worked. As the nobles entered, the entire servant line straightened. The queen in her velvet gown, the barons in chain and brocade, the ladies with veils of lace and perfumed gloves. They moved with calculated grace, each expecting their chair to be drawn at the perfect moment, their cups to be filled without asking, their needs met before they voiced them. The servants complied like clockwork. It was a ballet with no applause, and each participant had practiced the steps 1,000 times. Even as the nobles laughed, feasted, and raised toasts to conquests and future alliances, the servants were thinking 10 steps ahead. They watched for signs, a finger raised, a glance exchanged, a sudden cough. Each gesture meant something: a refill, a replacement, a retreat. Mistakes were rarely forgiven and never forgotten. When a noble dropped his napkin, a boy scrambled to fetch it before it touched the ground. When a roast was too tough, the kitchen was informed within seconds. The cook's expression did not change, but her eyes narrowed. A boy was dispatched to find a better cut. The rejected meat would be boiled down later, added to the servant's stew. No waste allowed. As the evening dragged on, candles sputtered lower. The wine flowed more freely. Laughter grew louder, and tempers shorter. Servants braced for the change in atmosphere that always came after the third toast. That was when secrets were told too freely, when jests turned into insults, when lords called for entertainments that made maids nervous. It was then that the highest risk tasks began. Sometimes a noble would demand a fresh gown from the laundry, or a lost brooch hidden in the rushes. A servant might be told to fetch a falcon's feather from the armory, or summon a minstrel too drunk to sing. These commands were not optional. Delay meant disgrace. Refusal was not even conceivable. And when at last the final dish was cleared, the final toast made, and the king retired to his chambers, the servants did not rest. Their work had only shifted from display to recovery. The great hall had to be cleaned of crumbs and bones, candles replaced, silver polished and counted, trenchers thrown to the pigs, or crumbled into sacks for the poor, if the steward allowed it. The floor had to be scrubbed, the benches stacked, and the rushes replaced where wine or grease had soaked through. Only when the hall was once again pristine, silent, cold, and ready for the next day, were the servants allowed their own version of supper. They did not eat in the great hall. They ate in corners, in kitchens, beside fireplaces, if they were lucky. They shared bread crusts and soup, and whatever the nobles had left behind. In these moments, stories were told in low voices. They spoke of strange dreams, of nobles' tempers, of things overheard behind tapestries. They warned each other which baron had grown crueler, which chambermaid had fallen pregnant, which page had been caught stealing. And then, one by one, they vanished into the stone. Some climbed to the garrets to sleep beneath the beams, curled on straw. Others slunk into the tunnels, to nests of rags near warm pipes. A few were permitted narrow cots near the kitchen. Most did not sleep deeply. They never did, because the bell would toll again before the sun rose, and the entire dance would begin anew. Night did not truly fall inside the castle walls. Though the great iron gates were drawn shut, and the torches along the outer walls lit like sentinels, within the stone labyrinth of corridors and chambers, life continued in a low and flickering rhythm. Sleep, for the servants, was neither long nor undisturbed. It was more a pause between demands, a brief, shallow surrender to exhaustion. The castle breathed at night, though differently than in the day. The thundering pace slowed to a whisper, but the wheels never ceased. Fires still needed tending. Coals had to be banked to keep the hearths alive until dawn. Chamber pots filled by nobles in the night had to be emptied before the morning bell. Blankets were adjusted over sleeping lords. Doors creaked softly open and closed as barefoot servants crept silently from one task to another. It was during these hours that the servants of the chamber emerged, those entrusted with the royal family's most intimate spaces. Unlike kitchen boys or laundresses, the chamber servants were chosen carefully, often through lineage or deep trust. They were quiet, efficient, and utterly forgettable, ideal traits for those who witnessed what others must never know. The king's chamber, guarded by two dozing men-at-arms in polished mail, lay at the far end of the upper corridor. The door was oak, bound in iron, its hinges oiled so well it moved without sound. Inside, the chambermaid who kept the king's quarters moved like a ghost. She refilled the wash basin with clean water. She replaced the beeswax candles with fresh ones from the steward's supply. She checked the linens, fluffed the goose-feather pillows, and ensured that the royal robes were folded with the fur lining outward. She would never see the king's face. Her duties were completed while he slept or was elsewhere. Her reward was a small cot behind the wood store and a heavy curtain to keep out the cold. But there was pride in her movements, pride in being chosen, pride in the silence she carried like a blade. Elsewhere in the castle, the night staff kept vigil. The lamplighter moved from sconce to sconce, ensuring that no corridor fell into total darkness. The night watch servants, often older men or those with weak knees who could no longer haul buckets or turn spits, walked slow rounds with iron keys on loops at their belts. They checked locks, whispered passwords to the guards, and made notes on wax tablets about anything unusual. A broken shutter, a strange sound, the faint smell of smoke. It was during the night hours that secrets flourished. Lovers met behind curtains. Whispers passed through keyholes. Occasionally, a noble's footsteps would echo down a corridor far from his own chamber, and no one would speak of it later. Servants saw much, but they had been trained from childhood to speak little. A servant who gossiped was a servant without employment. Not far from the king's quarters, in a quiet room tucked into the crook of the castle's eastern wing, the groom of the Stool lay awake. His cot was finer than most, not out of comfort, but readiness. Should the king ring the small silver bell at his bedside, the groom would have only moments to rise, light the lantern, and make himself presentable. He slept lightly, clothed, one boot on. His chamber was lined with tools, a lidded wooden commode, jars of fresh herbs and rosewater, fine linen cloths, and a polished pewter basin. These he kept cleaner than his own hands. He also kept a small book, hidden in the folds of his mattress. A book no one knew he could read. It contained notes in his own careful hand, not about the king's health or his digestion, but about his moods. The king often spoke freely, while the groom performed his duties. In those moments of vulnerability, he revealed fears, doubts, and secrets. The groom listened, nodded, and later recorded them, not for blackmail, but for understanding. If one was to serve, truly serve, one had to know the man as well as the monarch. As the castle settled into the deepest hours of night, there remained one group of servants whose duties had only just begun: the ashmen. They crept through the halls with soot-stained faces and cloth wrapped around their mouths, hauling heavy iron buckets to each hearth in turn. They collected the cooled ash from the previous day's fires and carried it out through side passages to the pits beyond the wall. Their work was silent, filthy, and unending. But if they failed to clear the ashes, the new fires would not catch, and the castle would greet dawn with cold stone and royal fury. These men worked in pairs, seldom speaking. They knew the creak of every stair and the hollow ring of every floorboard. They passed servants asleep in corners, sometimes covering a slumped shoulder with a scrap of blanket, sometimes stepping over an outstretched hand. They were the castle's final caretakers before the cycle began again. Near the kitchen, a young scullery girl stirred in her sleep, her arms wrapped around a ladle as if it were a doll. She had scrubbed until her knuckles cracked and bled. A small lamp flickered near her head, casting shadows on the wall. An older woman crept over and gently covered her with a tattered woolen shawl, saying nothing. The girl did not wake. She would rise in 3 hours and begin again. Somewhere above, the bell ringer leaned against the stones, watching stars wheel overhead. He alone had seen the night sky from that height every day for 20 years. He marked the hours by their light, by the chill of the wind, by the scent of dawn approaching. Below, the castle waited, stone and soul, breath and burden, the world of the servant winding tighter around the hearts of those within. In the narrow stone corridors that loop behind the king's great hall, passageways not drawn in official plans, known only to those whose lives depended on knowing them. These passages were used by the most trusted servants, those who moved not through the castle's grand doors, but behind its walls, like veins hidden beneath skin. It was here that the servants of the chamber operated, attending to the most personal aspects of the king's daily life. These were no ordinary men. The chamber servants, valets, cupbearers, wardrobe masters, were hand-selected for qualities that had nothing to do with strength or speed. They had to be invisible, utterly discreet, graceful in their movement, sharp in their perception, and unflinchingly loyal. They lived in the shadow of the crown, but closer to it than almost anyone else in the kingdom. The king, upon waking, was never alone. Before he opened his eyes, he would hear the soft clearing of a throat, the low murmur of a valet announcing the time, or the sound of warm water being poured into a silver basin. His personal servant, a man trained in deference, would be standing beside his bed, with a warm cloth draped over one arm, and fresh garments folded with perfect symmetry. The morning ritual of dressing the king was not rushed. It was a ceremony, even if no eyes were watching. Each item had to be inspected for wear. Linen undershirts were checked for fraying. Stockings were pulled snug with polished brass hooks. The royal doublet, often lined with rare furs or stitched with golden thread, had to be brushed and presented at just the right angle. The arms slipped on in complete silence. While the king bathed or relieved himself, tasks always done with an attending servant nearby, those in his chamber worked to arrange his day. Schedules were coordinated between steward, herald, and scribe. Meetings were listed, feasts prepared, hunt rides suggested or postponed, depending on weather. The groom of the stool kept a quiet distance, always near enough to be summoned by the smallest bell chime. His presence was both a sign of dignity and of discomfort. He was a reminder that even kings had needs they could not meet without help. But to serve in the king's chamber was not merely about bathing and dressing. These servants managed secrets. They heard the king's mutterings in half-sleep. They witnessed his moments of fear, his coughs, his fits of temper. They saw the scars hidden beneath his robes, the hair at his temples greying faster than the court acknowledged. And above all, they learned his patterns, what pleased him, what irked him, and when to speak or stay utterly silent. The cupbearer, for instance, had the singular task of presenting the king's wine, but the ritual required more than just pouring a drink. He must taste it first, in full view of the king. He must hand the goblet, with the stem between his thumb and third finger, bowing just enough to show humility without suggesting weakness. He must never spill a drop, and he must do it the same way every single time, no matter how tired or distracted he was. Wardrobe keepers were likewise expected to be artists of cloth. They managed not only what the king wore, but how he wore it. For the garments of a monarch were never random. The colour of his cloak could signal alliance or warning. The sigils stitched into his sleeves might remind a visiting lord of an old war or a blood debt. Even the tilt of his crown was adjusted according to mood, low over the brow in anger, high in triumph, slightly back when seeking favour. Within the Queen's quarters, similar protocols reigned, though often more complex. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting were noble-born, but they still performed service. They dressed her hair, fastened her bodices, applied powdered herbs to her temples when headaches struck. They read to her, embroidered with her, and walked with her in the gardens, all while ensuring her every word was recorded and reported to the appropriate ears. But for the lower-ranking maids and servants in the Queen's chamber, the work was more physical. They cleaned the rushes, tended the fire, carried perfumes, and changed sheets laced with herbs said to ward off spirits. They were often invisible to the noble women they served, yet they saw everything: secret glances, silent tears, bruises hidden beneath lace. The trust placed in the chamber servants was absolute and dangerous. Any hint of betrayal, any whisper repeated outside those walls, meant banishment or worse. Some servants had simply vanished, their names never spoken again. The rumour among the others was that they had been taken to the dungeons or given to the woods. No one dared ask what that meant. Yet despite the risk, to serve in the royal chamber was the highest aspiration of many young boys and girls born into the castle. It was a narrow path to advancement. A page who learned well might become a valet. A valet might, over many years, become a steward. And a steward, though never noble, held power that could shape the court. Among the most enigmatic of these chamber servants was an elderly man named Tomery, bent at the spine, with fingers long and soft as parchment. Tomery had been in service to 3 kings. No one remembered when he had begun, only that he had always been there. He was the king's dresser, but his duties extended beyond cloth. He knew the placement of every comb, the location of every signet ring. He was present when the king wept at night, when he laughed at inappropriate moments, when he stared into the hearth without speaking for hours. Tomery never wrote anything down. His mind was his ledger. He had seen lovers dismissed, favourites rise and fall, plots whispered through curtained beds, yet he had never spoken a word of it to anyone. And because of that silence, the king trusted him more than he trusted many lords. There was something sacred in that trust, a quiet truth shared between ruler and servant, where power was not exchanged, but witnessed. The chamber was not a battlefield, yet it required courage. It was not a pulpit, yet it demanded reverence. To serve, there was to exist on the edge of greatness, while knowing one would never be part of it. And still, each morning, the chamber servants returned. With clean hands, sharp eyes, and iron discipline, they pulled open the shutters, set the fires, and waited for the king to wake. In the dim, quiet corners of the royal palace, where light filtered through stained glass in fractured colours, and the silence was broken only by the soft slap of leather shoes on stone, there existed a role unlike any other in the kingdom. It was neither noble nor base, neither lauded nor reviled, but it was unquestionably essential. The man who held it was called the Groom of the Stool. To the uninitiated, the name sparked snickers. To the servants of the lower kitchens, or the squires who mucked stables, it sounded absurd. But among the trusted few who served within the king's chamber, the Groom of the Stool was a figure both peculiar and powerful, a man whose duties brought him as close to the monarch as any adviser or general could dream. He did not fight battles. He did not negotiate treaties, yet he was summoned daily, and often more than once. His role was to tend to the king's most private of needs, to aid him during moments of physical vulnerability, to ensure his personal hygiene, to track the health of his bowels, and to maintain the apparatus and dignity of royal toileting. But even this was only the surface. The current groom, a man named Edric, had begun his life as a page to a minor noble in the north. Quick of wit and careful of speech, he had risen quietly, serving in the wardrobe, then as an under-valet. He had caught the king's attention not through flattery or ambition, but through consistency. Edric never spoke out of turn. He never forgot a task. He had once, during a summer hunt, retrieved the king's personal satchel after it had fallen into a stream. He returned it dry, undamaged, and without demanding recognition. The king, who valued discretion in equal measure with loyalty, took note. When the previous groom of the Stool died of fever, Edric was selected. Some whispered it was a punishment, others a reward, but those who truly understood the politics of the chamber knew it was an elevation of the highest order. Each morning, Edric began his duties before the cock crowed. He checked the chamber for cleanliness, laid out the linen cloths, and inspected the commode, crafted of the finest oak, its lid carved with the royal crest. Within was a porcelain basin, removable for cleaning, lined with ash and lightly dusted with herbs. Small jars of scented oil, folded cloths, and a pitcher of warm water stood at the ready on a side table, arranged in ritual precision. The king would summon him not with voice, but with a small silver bell. Edric would enter silently, head bowed, and stand to the side unless addressed. His movements were precise, almost ceremonial. He did not flinch, did not glance, did not intrude. He waited, performed his tasks with dignity, and withdrew without comment. But there was more. During these moments of supreme vulnerability, when the king was unarmored, unguarded, and unadorned, he often spoke. Not commands, but musings, fears, complaints, thoughts unfinished, the kinds of words a man speaks only when he knows they will fall into silence. Edric never replied unless asked to, but he listened, and in listening he became a vessel for truth that no counselor or courtier could ever glimpse. The king, in Edric's presence, was not a ruler. He was a man, aging, burdened, sometimes uncertain. He confided in Edric matters of state, of marriage, of war, of doubt. And Edric, through long habit and unshakable discipline, carried these confessions like stones in his chest, never revealing them, never even hinting that he remembered. The other servants regarded Edric with wary respect. He did not command them. He did not supervise their tasks, but they stepped aside when he passed, eyes lowered, not out of disgust, but deference. For though his duties were humble in appearance, they were bound to power. It was whispered that Edric knew which lords had fallen from favour before they themselves knew it, that he knew who the king trusted, who he feared, who he suspected. Of course, he never confirmed any of it. Edric was a wall of silence. He kept no diary. He wrote no letters. He did not drink, nor jest, nor gamble. He walked with the posture of a noble, yet never wore cloth, finer than wool. He lived in a modest room behind the royal privy, where he kept a book of psalms, a plain wooden comb, and a single painting of his mother, long dead. There were moments when his power was more visible. Once, a new court physician suggested changing the king's diet to improve digestion. The physician was young, ambitious, and foolishly unaware of chamber protocol. Edric stood beside the king in silence as the man listed the benefits of various roots and broths. When the king turned to Edric and asked, "Do I eat too heavily, do you think?" Edric replied, "Your Majesty eats as your station commands." The physician was dismissed before sunset. Edric kept a meticulous record of the king's health, not on paper, but in memory. He noted changes in complexion, shifts in mood, appetite, and digestion. These observations were delivered in carefully chosen words to the royal physician during quiet walks through the outer gardens. The physician, though nominally superior, deferred to Edric's knowledge. It was understood. When it came to the king's body, the groom knew all. Despite the intimacy of his duties, Edric never presumed familiarity. He never called the king by anything but "Your Majesty." He never sat in the king's presence, never initiated conversation. And yet, when the court erupted in chaos, when news arrived of uprisings, or deaths, or betrayals, it was Edric whom the king often sought. Not for advice, for company. There was a comfort in being seen by someone who did not judge, a man who had known you without armor, without crown, without the trappings of royalty, a man who had helped you in your most humbling moments and had never once asked for anything in return. In this quiet, unglamorous role, Edric wielded a kind of invisible power, and he did so with the greatest strength a servant could possess: restraint. The role of the groom of the stool, though often reduced by jesters and fools to mere lavatory labor, was rooted in centuries of royal custom. It was not born of comedy, but necessity, and in time evolved into one of the most trusted, secretive, and quietly powerful positions in the realm. A strange irony shaped its nature, that the most intimate and seemingly humiliating task a man could perform could elevate him closer to the heart of the monarchy than all the armor or parchment in the kingdom. Long before Edric assumed the role, the office of the groom was one of ritual and symbolism. Medieval society regarded bodily functions not merely as private, but as deeply political. A king was thought to be semi-divine, chosen by God to govern, yet he still must eat, drink, and relieve himself. In those fragile, unavoidable moments, the illusion of divine perfection cracked. To preserve dignity, these acts had to be cloaked in protocol, controlled, dignified, and witnessed by only one: the groom. Each day began with la grande entrée, the ceremonial entry into the king's chamber. The king, even half awake and in bedclothes, was not to be seen by just anyone. Only a select handful of men, including the physician, the chaplain, the valet, and the groom of the stool, were allowed to enter. Edric stood among them in silence, his role singular. While others might assist the king with dressing or prayer, it was Edric who stood by as the king attended nature's call. The royal commode, though often carried in jest by the outside world as some crude chamber pot, was anything but crude. It was a finely crafted seat, often made of carved and lacquered wood, with embroidered cushions, and a porcelain bowl, fitted snugly into the frame. It was cleaned daily, dusted with lavender and mint, and maintained with obsessive care. Only Edric touched it. Not even the laundresses were permitted to clean the fabrics without his supervision. His tasks included preparing warm water for washing, folding linen cloths just so, and dabbing the king's skin with salves and soft powders after relieving himself. All of it was performed in perfect silence. Not once, not ever, did Edric allow expression, whether of distaste, humour, or pity, to flicker across his face. He was not a man, he was duty incarnate. And yet, the deeper function of his role had little to do with cloth or water. It was access. The groom of the Stool had uninterrupted time with the king. He stood beside him when the crown was off, when the sceptre was set aside, when the mighty became mortal. And it was in these moments, when a king had no armour, no courtiers, no audience, that truth emerged. Kings spoke to their grooms not as monarchs, but as men. They aired their fears. They vented their hatred. They whispered regrets about campaigns, children, wives. And the groom listened. The greatest of grooms were not only silent, but wise. They never repeated what they heard. They never used it. They absorbed it, considered it, and sometimes, if prompted, offered a word, not advice, but insight. Carefully crafted, stripped of judgment. Edric, over time, became a mirror for the king, one that did not reflect what he wanted to see, but what he needed. At court, this access made Edric a figure of legend. His name was rarely spoken aloud. Courtiers knew that to displease Edric, even subtly, could result in their name never being mentioned again at breakfast. They whispered about him. Did he influence appointments? Did he sway policy? Did he know about the Lord's affair before the Queen did? He answered none of it. He smiled faintly, bowed when addressed, and moved like a shadow. His days were dictated not by clocks, but by the king's rhythm. He did not retire unless the king retired. He did not eat until he knew the king was fed. His meals were taken in silence, in a private nook with a narrow window. He never dined with other servants, though he was never cruel to them. He offered small gestures, a shared apple, a woolen blanket left folded neatly for a cold scullery girl. He was not one of them, yet he never forgot them. Once, during a winter storm, the king was bedridden with fever and cramps. Physicians were summoned, herbalists brought in from distant counties. The royal family wept quietly in corners. It was Edric who never left his side. Through 3 sleepless nights, he sat beside the king's bed, wiping his brow, changing soiled linens, murmuring softly. When the king vomited blood, it was Edric who held the bowl. When the fever broke, the king, half delirious, whispered, "Are you still here?" Edric answered, "Always, my lord." When spring came, and the king walked again in the royal gardens, he leaned on Edric's arm. The court noticed, ambassadors noticed, but no one said a word. It was not uncommon for Edric to receive requests from lords or ladies, polite, flattering, subtle. They offered coins, gifts, even promises of land if he would mention a name or praise a petition. Edric accepted none of it. He did not need to be reminded that the crown was heavy and that those closest to it could burn. He had seen the downfall of men who flew too close. He had also seen what happened to those who tried to use the king's moments of vulnerability for gain. There was one servant before Edric who had dared hint, in jest, that the king's breath had been foul one morning. He was dismissed by nightfall. Another, long ago, had told a tale in the tavern about seeing the king stumble when rising from the stool. That man disappeared. Edric heard no more of him, and no one asked. Over the years, Edric developed a rhythm to his thoughts. He catalogued the king's meals, tracked the outcomes. He adjusted the king's routine gently, suggesting fewer apples, more stewed oats, always framing it as the steward's concern, never his own. The king complied, never questioning why. Edric's presence was steady, unjudging. He was a stone in the riverbed, shaping the water without ever speaking above it. There were darker days, too, days when the king wept during the morning ritual, his hands trembling, grief pouring forth from some unseen wound. Once, it was after the death of his hunting hound. Another, after a disastrous campaign in the south. The throne room did not see these moments. The court never imagined them. But Edric saw them, and he carried them, not with pride, not with sorrow, but with duty. And as the years passed, Edric aged in quiet harmony with the king. His beard turned grey, his fingers grew stiffer, his eyes, once sharp enough to catch a speck of dust on a collar, now needed help from candlelight. Yet, he never asked to be relieved. The king, likewise, never considered replacing him. It was a pact beyond words, beyond oath. It was made of daily presence, of silence, of shared mortality. For who but the groom of the stool could remind a king that even monarchs must sit, must strain, must sigh, and still remain sovereign? The queen's chambers were unlike the rest of the castle, though they too were built of stone and set high in the eastern wing, warmed by the sun in the morning hours. They carried a different air, lighter, perfumed, deliberate. The floors were strewn with fresh rushes and dried lavender, the tapestries woven in lighter threads, showing scenes not of war or conquest, but of courtship, mythology, and gardens of paradise. But beneath the silks and soft tones, the same rhythms of service held firm. Just as the king required constant tending, so too did the queen. Her circle was composed of two types of women, noble ladies-in-waiting and household servants. The former wore fine dresses and bore titles. The latter wore plain wool and moved like shadows. Yet in service, both bent the knee. Status could not replace responsibility. A noble-born maid might assist in brushing the queen's hair or selecting her jewels, but it was the chambermaid who laid the fire, who scrubbed the chamber pot, who ensured that every corner of the queen's suite remained immaculate. The queen rose later than the king, and her attendants gathered in the dressing chamber well before her eyes opened. Each had their task. One selected the gown, based on the day's visitors. Another opened the shutters to let in filtered light. A third warmed the scented oils used to anoint her neck and wrists. A fourth prepared a tiny cloth-wrapped packet of ground pearl and rose petal for her teeth. These routines were passed down through generations of servants, refined, improved, but never questioned. Among them, an older woman named Isolde had served 3 queens in her lifetime. Her hands were bent with age, but she knew the folds of every gown, the weight of every necklace. She spoke little. The other attendants respected her, feared her slightly, and did not dare displace the tools she arranged each morning. When Isolde declared a sleeve unfashionable or a lace too stiff, no argument followed. Her memory was the chamber's scripture. The queen's hair alone required half an hour each day. She did not dress herself. Such labor was beneath a woman of her station. Instead, 2 attendants brushed her tresses with combs made of ivory, then wove them into braids, coils, or waves, depending on mood and message. For hair in court was more than vanity. It was power. A high braid signaled formality. Loosened curls meant favor. A covered head could declare grief, humility, or control. Bathing was a rare event, perhaps once every 10 days, more frequently in the warm months. The bath was drawn by hand. Hot water, boiled in the kitchens, was carried by girls in shifts, each copper pail steaming, the ascent up spiral stairs perilous. Once the wooden tub was filled, flowers or herbs were scattered into the water, and perfumed oils were added drop by drop. The bath chamber would be heated with coals, and fresh cloths laid upon the floor. When the queen stepped into the water, only her most trusted ladies remained. The others waited outside, their heads bowed, the air filled with the scent of rose and sweet birch, the steam softening even the edges of stone. Conversations in these moments were not idle. The queen might speak of her husband's moods, of alliances forming in the shadows, of letters sent in secret. A lady in waiting, who listened well, might gain favor. One who asked too much might be dismissed. And so, discretion became a servant's most valuable skill, more than stitching, more than cleaning, more than navigating court gossip, because the queen's secrets were dangerous. To know them was to hold something that could lift a woman to power or send her tumbling into exile. Outside the inner chamber, maids polished buckles, scrubbed basins, and repaired torn hems by candlelight. They were the unseen hands behind the throne. They worked with needle and thread until their fingers bled, and no one ever remembered their names. Yet without them, the queen could not appear flawless. Meals for the queen were lighter than those served to the king, but prepared with no less care. Fruits, soft cheeses, roasted capons, almond pastries, sweet wines. A taster always ate first, and when the tray was carried in by the serving girls, their eyes were to the ground, their hands steady. A spilled sauce or poorly folded napkin could mean a change of assignment, a quiet punishment, delivered without word. The queen's days were filled with audiences, petitions, letters, prayers, embroidery, music. At every moment, a servant was nearby, one to refill ink, one to press the folds of her gown, one to stand with hands clasped in case a messenger arrived. These women, though seemingly idle, were never at rest. Their minds were alert, their movements restrained, their presence constant. Some among them served from girlhood to grave. They never married, never bore children, their lives consumed in devotion to one woman whose status they helped maintain. Others left service through marriage, often to lesser lords or merchants who prized a wife schooled in courtly customs. There were darker truths too. When the queen miscarried, when her health failed, or when a secret child was born and whisked away before dawn, it was the servants who knew. It was they who cleaned the blood from sheets, who whispered prayers, who kept silent while the court spun lies of health and divine favor. Among them, there were sometimes friendships. A young maid and a seasoned lady might share a glance, a smile, a morsel of cake. They might exchange secrets, songs from childhood, or dreams never spoken aloud. And in the stillness of the long nights, when the queen finally slept, and the halls echoed only with the creak of timber and distant bells, these women sometimes sat together in the outer chamber, sewing in silence, warmed by one another's presence. They were invisible, yes, but they were also indispensable. There was one among them, a woman named Elaine, who had begun her service as a mere seamstress's apprentice, folding gowns and polishing clasps at the back of the queen's dressing chamber. She was not of noble birth, nor did she possess wealth, but she carried herself with a calm precision that caught the attention of the senior attendants. When she threaded a needle, it never slipped. When she poured water into a basin, it never splashed. And when she listened, she truly listened, with eyes still, breath shallow, and not even a flicker of reaction upon her face. The Queen took note of her one winter morning, after a long night of courtly pageantry and a quarrel with the king behind closed doors. Elaine had been the only servant present when the Queen's tears fell silently onto the table as she sat for her hair to be unbraided. She said nothing, did not offer comfort, did not pause her hands, but continued to gently comb, working with such reverence that the Queen finally whispered, "You see everything and yet speak nothing." Elaine only nodded. From that day forward, she was assigned directly to the Queen's side. Soon she was helping with letters, sorting the sealed ones by ribbon color, placing ink pots at precise angles on the writing desk, reading aloud in the evenings by firelight when the Queen's eyes were tired. She was still a servant, yes, but her closeness to the Queen became apparent. Her presence in meetings, her hand at the Queen's elbow during walks, her voice heard softly during council pauses. Some of the noble ladies grew suspicious. A handmaid does not belong at the table of state, one whispered, but none dared question the Queen's choice. Elaine had become something rarer than a favorite. She had become trusted. And yet her power was unspoken. She did not command, nor interfere, nor boast. When younger girls came to her with questions about the Queen's moods, or about how to fold the nightgown just so, Elaine answered gently, but guardedly. "The closer you stand to the fire," she would say, "the more careful you must be with your shadow." But proximity brought danger, as all servants learned in time. In her 4th year of service, Elaine discovered something not meant to be seen. It was late. A storm had broken over the castle, and most had gone to sleep early. The Queen had dismissed her with a soft wave of the hand, asking to be alone. But Elaine, always dutiful, returned to retrieve a forgotten box of letters from the outer bedchamber. As she reached for the box near the hearth, she heard hushed voices, not servants, but men. Men she recognized from the court, yet whose presence in the Queen's private chamber should have been impossible. Through the slightly ajar door, she glimpsed shadows. A scroll passed, a name spoken, a word that chilled her. Abdication. She backed away, as if she had heard nothing. She returned to her quarters and said not a word. But something had shifted. In the following days, the Queen's mood darkened. Elaine noticed it in the way she avoided the mirror, the way she clutched the crucifix on her necklace with quiet intensity. The noble women seemed tense, and one evening, the steward himself came to the Queen's chambers to inspect the servant ledgers. That night, Elaine did not sleep in her cot. In the morning, her place was empty. Her needle was still threaded on the table. Her shoes were beneath the bench, but she was gone. No one spoke of her, not openly. Some whispered that she had been reassigned to a convent, others that she had been sent to a distant manor. A few said she had simply walked into the storm and never returned. But among the servants, when the fire burned low and the castle was quiet, her name lingered like the scent of perfume, long faded. Not all stories ended in silence, however. Another, a woman named Isabet, rose from chambermaid to become the Queen's voice, a woman who read letters aloud, recorded replies, and eventually spoke to ambassadors on the Queen's behalf. She was well-spoken, precise, and unnaturally calm. Unlike Elaine, she courted power. Carefully. She was never unkind, but she made sure the other women knew who was watching. When she walked into a room, conversation shifted. Isabet believed that power, when held by a servant, must be wielded with gloves, fine silken gloves that left no fingerprints. Her assent was not through affection, but through utility. The Queen relied on her, not out of comfort, but necessity. And that gave Isabet an edge sharper than any blade. The other servants tread cautiously around her, not out of fear, but out of awareness. If the Queen's chamber was a stage, Isabet stood at the footlights, directing shadows. And still, beneath all these women, Elaine the beloved, Isabet the poised, worked the anonymous many, the girls who came before dawn to light the hearth, the older women who brushed lint from cloaks and stitched torn chemises in silence, the ones who held bowls beneath sick mouths, who carried towels soaked in childbirth blood, who swept away the petals after weddings and the ashes after death. They never touched letters or spoke to nobles, yet the Queen saw them. Sometimes she left small gifts, a ribbon on a girl's cot, an extra loaf wrapped in cloth. She knew, perhaps more than the king, that her grandee stood upon the tired backs and raw hands of women who would never be thanked. In this chamber, in this world, women served, but they also survived. They created alliances in silence, shared glances across candlelight that meant wait, now, go. They passed warnings, folded into sleeves. They carried truths not in scrolls, but in memory. They bore witness. They endured. Beneath the stained glass windows of the castle chapel, where light spilled in coloured patterns across the stone floor, and the air was heavy with incense and dust, the youngest servants of noble blood knelt in silence. They were not servants in the traditional sense. They bore family names, had coats of arms stitched into their cloaks, and would one day command men of their own. But for now, they served. For now, they were pages. To be a page was a rite of passage for noble boys, a path set not by choice, but by birth. At the age of 7, sometimes younger, a boy was sent from his family estate to the castle of a greater lord, or the royal court itself. There, he would begin his education, not with books or tutors alone, but through the humbling art of obedience. He carried scrolls, fetched cloaks, served at the royal table. He learned to pour wine without spilling, to walk without dragging his boots, to bow deeply and hold it long enough. He learned silence, restraint, and vigilance, not for survival, as the common servants did, but for discipline. It was said that no knight could be trusted who had not first learned to wait with his hands folded and his eyes downcast. They were dressed finely, yes, velvets and wool, with polished leather boots and brass buttons, but they slept in shared rooms, on hard cots, and rose at dawn with the rest of the staff. Their days began with prayer and ended with practice, swordplay, horsemanship, dance. Yet in between, they served. They opened doors. They followed lords through rain and mud. They stood beside their masters for hours on end, holding swords, goblets, or even dogs on silken leashes. Some bore it well. Others cracked under the weight of pride. There was one, a boy named Alric, son of a minor earl, who had been sent to court with great expectations. His family boasted a lineage reaching back to the old wars. But Alric, accustomed to being doted on, had never been told no until the day the castle's steward ordered him to scrub the floor outside the chapel after tracking mud through it. He refused. The steward said nothing. The next day, Alric found his cloak replaced with a plainer one. His seat at dinner was moved to the far bench. His name was no longer called during morning drills. He lasted 3 days before kneeling in apology, hands chafed from unexpected labor, and when the steward handed him back his cloak, not with pride, but with quiet acknowledgement, Alric took it with both hands and bowed deeper than ever before. He had learned the first lesson of service. No one is born above the rules of a house, not even those who will one day rule houses of their own. The squires, older than the pages, were not spared this discipline. Between the ages of 12 and 15, boys were elevated to the rank of squire, a half-step to knighthood, but one still rooted in humility. Squiring was labor. A squire must rise before his knight, polish his mail, oil his weapons, saddle his horse, and ride in silence beside him. In battle, a squire carried water, bound wounds, and sometimes stood in the path of danger before the knight did. The castle squires lived on the edge of 2 worlds. They were young men, learning the weight of steel, yet still expected to fetch and carry. They joked among themselves behind closed doors, but the moment they entered the main hall, they stood straight and spoke only when spoken to. Their hands bore blisters, not just from swords, but from scrubbing, lifting, mending. They practiced in the yard under the eye of Sir Morven, a knight long past his prime, but sharper than any blade. He beat them with blunted sticks when they faltered, not out of cruelty, but principle. A knight who cannot bow, he said once, cannot lead. And every boy remembered those words. Not all squires rose to glory. Some were dismissed. Some died, of illness, of accidents, of failure on the field. Others gave up, fled, returned home in disgrace. But those who endured, who bore the weight of armor and expectation, emerged not only as warriors, but as men shaped by service. Pages and squires had little in common with the castle's scullery boys or fire tenders, but in their own way they were servants too, and the castle taught them as it taught everyone, with routine, silence, and humility. In rare moments of rest, squires might share stolen bread with a kitchen boy, or help lift a heavy cask from the cellar. They learned respect not through lectures, but through the shared weariness of long days. They saw how the groom of the Stool moved without speaking, how the chambermaids worked until their backs bent, how the steward's silence held more command than a shout. And slowly they understood. Service was not weakness. It was foundation. A knight might wield a sword. A lord might hold land. But a true leader learned first how to serve, how to carry weight, how to hold silence, how to bow and mean it. And in the quiet corridors of the castle, when dusk fell and the great hall emptied of nobility, it was the pages and squires who stayed behind to carry torches, straighten chairs, and sweep the rushes, learning day by day, not just how to command men, but how to earn their loyalty. While the castle's labouring servants were born into a life of toil, the pages arrived with crests on their sleeves and rings in their travelling chests. Yet within days, the castle stripped them of illusion. Titles mattered little in the scullery or the yard. At court, noble birth opened doors, but within the castle's heart, discipline opened them wider. There were nearly 24 pages housed in the east wing of the castle, beneath the old bell tower. Their beds were little more than wooden frames and coarse wool blankets, arranged in tight rows, their footlockers pressed against the walls. Their lives were governed by a rigid schedule, each hour accounted for, each task inspected. They woke at dawn to the first toll of the tower bell. Sleep was not optional. The bell would not wait for tired eyes. The boys dressed quickly, folding their nightshirts and placing them neatly under their cots. Order was expected in everything. A page who left a tunic draped carelessly over a chair might find it gone the next morning, replaced by none, his punishment to stand cold during breakfast prayers. After morning devotions, they began their duties. Pages were assigned to noblemen, ladies, and senior knights. A favoured few were chosen to serve directly at the royal table. This was a mark of great trust and great pressure. At dinner, the royal household watched the pages closely, noting their posture, speech, and handling of items. A shaky hand could spill wine. A bowed head too low might miss a signal. And in a court where mistakes were remembered longer than victories, a single misstep could shadow a boy's name for years. Yet for all the caution and ritual, life as a page was not joyless. There were moments between duty and drill when laughter broke out like spring after frost. In the evenings, the boys practiced swordplay with sticks in the courtyard, cheering and jeering as blows landed. They raced through the orchard, daring each other to climb the highest branches. They whispered secrets after the lights were out. Who had seen the princess smile? Who had touched a real sword? Who had dreams of glory on the battlefield? They lived between two worlds, too noble to serve forever, but not yet noble enough to command. Their instructors were varied. Swordmasters taught them the forms of combat. Heralds taught them lineage, coats of arms, the art of reading a family by the banners they bore. Priests drilled them in Latin prayers and scripture. But it was the castle itself that was their truest teacher. They learned how to walk silently down long corridors, how to bow before different ranks, how to carry messages without embellishment. They learned to observe without appearing to look. They learned patience, not the stillness of waiting, but the alertness of readiness. One boy, Mathan, was son to a baron whose lands bordered the eastern marches. His father was known for hunting wolves, and his mother for her icy letters to the queen. Mathan arrived at court with pride sharpened into a blade. He corrected other pages. He spoke too quickly. He smirked at the kitchen staff. Within 2 weeks, he found himself reassigned to the kennel master. He protested. "I am a noble," he said. "You are a page," the steward replied, "and dogs know rank better than boys." For a month, Mathan woke before dawn to clean stalls, feed hounds, and haul straw. He carried the stink of the kennels into his meals, but slowly the edge of him dulled. He spoke less. He listened more. When he was reassigned to carry messages for the captain of the guard, he did so without complaint. By the following year, he stood beside the prince during a hunting trip, calm, composed, and capable. He had learned that the castle shaped those who did not resist its lessons. As for the squires, their lives were even more grueling. For them, every hour was physical. Sword drills, shield work, horse grooming, weapon maintenance. Their masters, the knights they served, did not coddle them. They demanded excellence and punished laxity. Each squire was paired with a knight whose armor they bore, and whose life they protected in battle. They learned to read the weight of steel, to adjust straps blindfolded, to ride not only with poise, but with readiness. They polished greaves until they shone like mirrors. They practiced falling, dismounting, rolling to their feet with sword drawn. And yet, for all the martial training, their most valuable lessons were not in the yard, but in the small things. A squire learned the temperament of his knight, when to speak, when to fall back. He learned the knight's preferences in food, wine, bedding, horses, and even silence. Some squires became closer to their knights than sons, trusted, favored, sometimes loved. Others served harsh masters, enduring scorn and beatings without word. But all were shaped. The path to knighthood was not simply about battle, it was about bearing. Could a boy stand still for hours during a ceremony? Could he hold composure in the face of insult? Could he speak to a duchess without blushing or offending? One squire, Tolan, had grown up among soldiers. His father was a captain, his mother dead young. He entered service at 13, with a sword already calloused into his hand. He fought better than most squires twice his age. But during a feast, he spilled a goblet of wine on a visiting ambassador's tunic. He froze, then laughed. He was sent to the stables for 6 months. When he returned, he bowed lower, spoke less, drank water instead of wine. When he was knighted, years later, he remembered the lesson. Skill without grace is still weakness. The squires also held a strange camaraderie. They sparred together, but also bled together. They tied bandages on one another after rough training. They shared stories of their knights' eccentricities. They helped one another learn courtly forms, how to fold letters, how to present gifts, how to behave at royal weddings. And though they came from noble families, most formed real friendships with servants. They passed food to hungry fire tenders. They protected kitchen boys from bullies. They watched how the steward moved, how the chambermaids read the court's mood. And from this, they learned humility. A good squire did not command with his chin high. He led with his eyes open. And when one of their own failed, when a boy lost his way, or fell to arrogance, or stumbled in service, they did not mock him. They helped him, because in the castle, failure touched everyone in time. By the time a squire was knighted, usually in a ceremony lit by torches and blessed with oil, he had served for nearly a decade. He had learned to wield a sword, but also a towel, a comb, a tray. He knew how to make a bed, deliver a message, sit in silence beside a grieving lord. And when he finally strapped on a sword of his own and rode beside the banners of his house, he did so not only as a warrior, but as a man who had served. Because before one could defend a kingdom, he had to first learn how to carry it. When the sun slipped behind the battlements, and the last arrow of golden light fled the chapel's tower, the castle did not sleep. It merely shifted its breath. The laughter of courtiers faded. The great hall's fires dimmed, and noble footsteps gave way to the softer, stealthier tread of the night servants, whose domain began only after the world above had fallen quiet. These were the watchers, the gliders, the caretakers of silence. Few knew their names, fewer noticed their work, but without them, the castle would unravel in the dark. They were the ones who ensured that dawn did not arrive to chaos, that no torch ran dry, no shadow hid danger, and no ember grew into fire. The most visible among them were the night guards, men clad in simple leather jerkins, with long blades sheathed at their hips and oil lamps swinging from hooks on their belts. They did not wear the plate armor of daytime sentries. It was too loud, too cumbersome. Their purpose was not to stand as symbols, but to listen, to sense. They patrolled the quiet halls, walked the curtain walls, and kept their ears attuned to the faintest sound. The creak of wood, the scurry of a rat, the footfall that came too fast or from the wrong direction. The guards were rotated every month between posts, inner corridor, outer wall, storeroom, chapel. No man patrolled the same route long enough to grow complacent. The steward demanded it. "Repetition dulls the eyes," he would say. "Surprise keeps them sharp." And so the guards walked, hour after hour, through fog, frost, and the close heat of summer nights. Their eyes grew accustomed to candlelight, and their hands to silence. A dropped key, a coughing noble, a door ajar, each detail logged mentally, to be reported without fuss in the morning. Some guards were veterans too old for war, but too proud for stillness. Others were men seeking redemption, a second life after disgrace, a place where they could serve in anonymity. Many were local, born in the nearby villages, brought in as boys, hardened by service and kept by loyalty. Alongside them moved the torchbearers. These were usually younger, leaner boys, too small for armor, but quick and bright-eyed. They were apprenticed to the night guard, tasked with maintaining every torch in the castle. By dusk, they lit each one. By midnight, they checked them. By dawn, they extinguished them. Their route stretched through hundreds of corridors, stairwells, balconies, and halls. Each torch had to burn clean and evenly. A flickering light was more than an inconvenience. It was a hazard. Fire, in a castle built of timber roofs and rush-covered floors, was the greatest enemy of all. They carried brass tongs, flint kits, and oil flasks strapped across their backs. They worked in pairs, never alone, for the castle at night could be eerie even to those raised within it. Some torches hung high, requiring ladders or clever tricks with long-handled poles. Others burned beside rooms forbidden to most, such as the royal treasury or the armory vault. Here, the torchbearers worked with their eyes averted, backs straight. They knew never to touch doors, never to ask questions, never to linger. Behind the walls moved a different kind of night servant, the coal runners and ashmen, whose task it was to tend the castle's many hearths and ovens through the long hours. The fires in the Queen's chamber, in the garrison's kitchen, in the outer keep's bakery, they could not go cold. These fires provided warmth, cooked the bread to be baked at dawn, and heated the water for morning ablutions. The coal runners worked in shifts, hauling scuttles of blackened fuel up winding stairs and through narrow servant passages. Their backs were always hunched, their hands always dirty. Some barely spoke, their lungs already damaged by years of soot and dust. But they moved swiftly, precisely, and with reverence. Their leader, a grizzled man named Tam, had worked the night route for nearly 40 years. His eyes were always red, his voice rasped like sandpaper, but he knew every hearth by its scent, could tell when one had gone out before even reaching it. It was said that once he caught a fire moments before it spread from the guard room to the east hall, saving a quarter of the castle. The king never heard of it. Tam didn't mind. He carried the scorch-marked poker on his belt like a medal. Perhaps the most overlooked of all were the chamber whisperers, servants assigned to stay outside the doors of sleeping nobles, to listen for distress, to assist without ever being seen. These were usually older women and men who had proven themselves trustworthy beyond doubt. They did not enter unless called, but they heard everything. They heard sobs muffled into pillows. They heard feverish murmurs. They heard sleepwalkers and nightmares and the rustle of secret meetings at midnight, and they said nothing. Their presence was like that of saints on a painted wall, watching, knowing, silent. Some were chosen by the queen or the king personally. Others were assigned by the steward. All were trained to walk without sound, to breathe slowly, to vanish before being noticed. At the far edge of the castle grounds, near the cliffside where gulls cried in the dark and the wind beat against the outer tower, the bell-ringer's apprentice climbed the narrow spiral steps to the highest turret. There he kept vigil in solitude, his duty to toll the great bell should fire break out, should enemies be spotted by night, should the king perish in his sleep. He had a horn as well, carved from oxbone and worn smooth by generations of hands. He prayed never to use it, but he practiced each week, so the sound would not fail when truly needed. He slept in a cot beneath the rafters, his window open to the sea wind. Rats nested in the beams, bats clung to the eaves, but he remained, because the castle, even while sleeping, was never still. It breathed through him. Below, in a small alcove near the chapel, an old woman named Lena tended a single flame in a hanging lantern. She was the prayer keeper, not a nun, not a servant in the usual sense. Her duty was to sit through the night and whisper prayers for the safety of the castle. She had been doing it since the plague had swept the lowlands, 40 winters before. Her voice was barely louder than the wind, but the castle heard her. All these servants, the guards, the torchbearers, the ashmen, the whisperers, the bellboy, the prayer woman, formed the spine of the night. Their names were not sung, their deeds were not recorded, but their vigilance was the difference between peace and disaster. And so, when the final candles in the royal quarters were snuffed, when the laughter of the feast was only an echo, and when the stars wheeled silently over the great stone keep, it was these unseen few who watched, who worked, who kept the night safe for kings and beggars alike. The castle was not just stone and fire, not merely a tapestry of labor and silence. It was a machine powered by control. Behind every task, every whisper of duty, lay a set of rules, some spoken aloud in the steward's quarter, others passed by glance and gesture, and still others unspoken, yet universally understood. To break those rules, whether by accident, ignorance, or rebellion, was to face punishment. But to keep them, to obey, not just in action, but in manner, was to earn reward. Rare, fleeting reward. Discipline in the castle was absolute. It was not administered by whim, though from below it might feel that way. It was doled out through an intricate web of hierarchy. The steward oversaw the punishments of the household staff. Senior knights disciplined their squires. The chamberlain saw to the chambermaids. The cook ruled over the scullions with a wooden ladle that struck faster than a viper's fang. For many, punishment began not with pain, but with hunger. To have your portion reduced was a common penalty. A servant who arrived late to the morning bell might find half a loaf instead of a full one. One who spoke out of turn might be handed cold broth, while others received meat. It was an elegant punishment. No bruises, no screams, just the slow creeping of weakness into the body. Hunger made a servant sharper, more obedient, or broken. More serious infractions met harsher penalties. A page who mocked a noble might be sent to the stables to clean manure. A laundress who ruined a royal garment might be reassigned to latrine duty. These roles were not merely unpleasant. They were designed to strip pride. The castle walls were lined with such reminders. Everyone remembered the boy from the kitchens, Cedric, who once ate a pear meant for the queen's table, a single piece of fruit. He confessed out of guilt, or perhaps fear, after the steward noticed one missing. He was not beaten. Instead, he was made to sit at the feast, at the far end of the hall, hands folded in his lap, watching every course be served, without touching a single bite. His punishment was not pain, but humiliation. The story was whispered for years after. Cedric never stole again. Some punishments were silent. A girl caught eavesdropping on a courtier was never accused aloud, but she was reassigned, her bedding removed, her name removed from the roster. She worked thereafter in the castle's dark underhalls, boiling linens stained from childbirth, alone with steam and silence. No one ever asked her what she had heard. When discipline rose to the steward's attention, a ceremony was held. Not public. Servants were not executed in courtyards like criminals, but formal. The guilty were brought to the steward's chamber. They knelt, they listened. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they were struck with a switch of willow, 3 lashes, no more, enough to mark, never to maim. Pain was not the goal. Memory was. The steward believed in economy of punishment. A servant is not a mule, he once said. If you beat a mule, it cannot carry you. So he punished with precision. He spoke softly, even during rebuke, and the weight of his disappointment often stung more than the strap. But there were darker forms of justice, whispered among the servants late at night. Some servants who stole repeatedly, who betrayed a secret, who touched what they should not. They vanished. No one ever saw the punishment. They simply did not wake in their beds. Their belongings were cleared. Their names erased from the duty lists. The steward never spoke of them. The guards never answered questions. The castle moved on. It was believed they were sent to the mines, or to the ice cellars, or even the coastal outposts, where wind and sea salt carved flesh from bone. But no one truly knew, and that was the point. Fear kept the line sharp. But punishment was not the only language of discipline. There was its counterpart, rarer, gentler, and more dangerous in its temptation: reward. When a servant performed with excellence, when they surpassed expectation, sometimes, just sometimes, they were recognized. A loaf still warm from the oven left on a cot, a new pair of boots, an extra blanket before winter. These were small miracles. For pages and squires, a word of praise from the steward or knight was a jewel, a touch on the shoulder, a nod. Once, a young squire named Loras carried his wounded knight 2 miles after a skirmish with bandits. For this, the king himself gifted him a sword. Not ornate, just strong steel, well balanced. But Loras wept when he received it. Not for the weapon, but for the recognition. Some rewards came in the form of better postings. A chambermaid might be promoted to linen supervisor. A footman might be asked to carry the Queen's letters. A page might be invited to serve during a royal hunt. These small elevations meant more food, better rest, and proximity to power. One of the highest honors was to be given a name. Many servants, especially the lowest, were known by title or function alone: the kettle girl, the west stair boy, the one who cleans the lamps. To be called by name by a noble was rare. To hear one's name spoken with warmth, rarer still. It was a reward greater than coin. It meant you were remembered. And of course, there were festivals. Twice a year, during the high feasts of spring and midwinter, the king allowed for a servants' day. On these days, no work was required past the bare minimum. Tables were set up in the lower courtyard, and food, real food, from the royal kitchens, was served to the staff. Meat pies, cheeses, fruit, cider. There was music, sometimes laughter. For a few hours, the barrier between noble and servant thinned. The steward would walk among them then, cloak off, face bare. He would speak to the cooks, the torch boys, the maids. He would thank them, and for some, it was the first time they truly felt seen. But these moments were fleeting. By the next day, duties resumed, the rules returned, the walls remembered, and so the balance held. Punishment to correct, reward to remind, and discipline to preserve the fragile order upon which the castle depended. Because if the servants ever forgot their place, or if the masters ever forgot who kept the walls upright, the whole world might collapse. When travellers from distant realms approached the royal castle, they spoke of its towers, of its great hall with banners of gold, of the iron portcullis that could drop in a breath, and the stone walls so thick they whispered no secrets. They spoke of the king's smile from his throne, the queen's elegance beneath her veil, the knights in shining rows. They marvelled at the stained glass, the polished floors, the chiming of bells at dawn. But they never spoke of the servants. They did not mention the old woman who lit the fires at daybreak, or the boy who scraped candle wax from the chapel's floor. They did not see the hand that filled the goblet, or the fingers that laced the queen's bodice. They tasted the food, but not the scalded skin that stirred it. They sat upon chairs made straight and strong by someone who would never sit there. The castle's soul was not its stones, it was them. The servants did not ask to be remembered. They did not leave signatures on the walls. Their letters, if they wrote any, were rarely preserved. They were born in the castle or brought in as children, and they often died there, buried in simple graves beyond the chapel wall, marked only by a stone and a name. Sometimes not even that. But if one listened, truly listened, in the hush before dawn, they might hear their presence still. In the creak of the wardrobe door that had been opened 10,000 times by the same hand, in the echo of a soft footfall down the corridor, too familiar to be the wind, in the scent of rosemary tucked beneath the rushes, replaced every morning by hands now long gone. Each servant, though unseen, left traces in the ritual of the place, a way the stew was stirred, a lullaby hummed as linens were folded, a blade polished in just a certain rhythm. These were the memory of labour, passed not by book, but by repetition, through generations, taught not in words, but in motion. There were stories the castle never told aloud. The boy who once saved the prince from fire by pulling him from a collapsing kitchen wall. The chambermaid who took the queen's beating when she discovered the letter. meant for a lover. The butler who died standing, tray still balanced, as an arrow struck him during a feast ambush. No bards sang of them, no statues were carved, but the castle remembered. In the stillness of the empty great hall after midnight, the floorboards bore the impression of their passing. The torches burned in the sockets they had cleaned. The tables still gleamed from the polish of their cloth. And the kings and queens, in their old age, sometimes paused longer than usual after a servant left the room, as if remembering something, a scent, a sound, a presence now gone. Some whispered a name, most did not, because royalty too understood, however deeply buried, that the greatness of their reigns rested on those who bowed and did not break. The servants were the castle's breath, its heartbeat, its very spine. They were the ones who rose while others slept, who worked while others ruled, who wept unseen, endured unnoticed, and yet never let the kingdom fall. And so, though the world forgets them, the stone remembers.